Because you see, it was only then that the friends realized somebody had to take care of Stiffy Green. Well, they talked about it, and one of John Heinel's distant cousins decided he'd take the dog, but at first it wouldn't go. The dog growled and snapped, almost like he wanted to stay there. Well, eventually somebody found a rope. They tied the dog up and drug him home. The next day he was gone. He had chewed through the rope. Well, they looked for him all over town, and eventually they found him sitting right in front of the Heinel family mausoleum in Highland Lawn Cemetery. Well, they took the dog home, tied him more securely, got out again. This happened 4 or 5 times. No matter how securely they tied the dog, he would always somehow find a way to get away and always be found back, guarding the eternal rest of his master. Well, according to the old stories that they tell in the area, eventually the cemetery workers decided to adopt the dog. They built a little shelter for him behind the mausoleum, and they give him parts of their lunch or dinner to keep him by, and well, apparently they say that Stiffy Green had a pretty good life of it for a couple of years until he too died, an old dog. Well, now I got to warn you, the story gets even weirder, okay? Because when the news of Stiffy Green's death leaked into the community, a group of John Heinel's friends got together to decide what to do with the dog's body. Some said they should just discard it or throw it away. But somebody else had another idea. Now this is the weird part. They took the dog's body to a taxidermist and had it stuffed. Ew, isn't that weird? I've come to find out that actually was very common in the early 1900s. Field Museum made a fortune doing that for folks. If your favorite pet died, just stuff them and keep them around. Ugh. Anyway, whatever the case, when Stiffy Green's body had been returned to a startling likeness of life, they took it back to the Highland Lawn Cemetery, to the Heinel family mausoleum. Once again, they opened that creaky iron gate. They put the dog's body sitting right next to John Heinel's casket. One of the friends there at the time said it was appropriate now that master and friend were together. With that, they shut that gate with a clang. Once again, that ought to be the end of the story. Once again, it's not. Because you see, a number of months later, in late September, a cemetery worker, was putting his tools in his car after a long, hard day's work. As he was shutting the trunk to his car, ready to go home and have dinner with his wife, he heard a sound that made him stop. It was barking coming from inside the cemetery. Well, that happens. Stray dogs come in, and he knew what he had to do, find whatever dog it was and run it out before he could go home. But as he followed the sound of that barking, a couple things began to bother him. One was that barking sounded familiar, almost like he'd heard it before. And the other? Well, the other is as he followed the sound of that barking, he realized he was walking in the direction of the Heinel family mausoleum. Just as he got to the hedgerow opposite the mausoleum, the barking stopped, and that worker crouched down behind a bush for a long, silent second. Then he reached out, pulled back that bush, he looked across the mausoleum. He saw absolutely nothing. There was no dog there. Probably just some stray dog had found his way in and run out again. The worker stood up and decided to go home and tell his wife what a fool he'd been. And it was then as he was turning back to go to his car that he saw a sight that he later swore he'd never forget. Because through that dusk of early autumn, walking along the leaves in the fence row that separates Highland Lawn Cemetery from the streets of Terre Haute, there walked a figure, or actually a pair of figures. One was the shadowy figure of an old man with a walking stick and a pipe in his mouth, padding contentedly by his side. The figure of a small dog, even from a distance. The worker swore that dog's eyes glowed green with peace and contentment, now that master and friend were together forever. Thank you. I had sort of a quick diversion, and I'll get back to where I was going, because there's actually another sort of a smaller ghost story that is born of really strange historical fact from Highland Lawn Cemetery in Terre Haute. And it's not really so much of a narrative like that one was. But it is kind of interesting. and it's based on history, and this much I know is true. About, probably 600 feet, maybe a little bit more, from the Heil family mausoleum, there is a mausoleum to another man in Terre Haute named John Steinbeck. Now, John Steinman was famous both for his life and for his death, and maybe for his afterlife. You see, he was a town character. In the 1920s, he had grown up in Terre Haute. He left to go back to go down to Texas to make his fortune, and unlike so many, he actually did. When he moved back to Terre Haute in the 20s, he was an incredibly rich man. The only thing it was, he thought he was still in Texas. And I've actually read accounts at the time. He was somebody who wore a 6-gun in the streets, refused to give it up, wore a 10-gallon hat even though he was in the middle of rural Indiana. He was really a larger-than-life character. He really was. Well, late in his life, John Steinbeck got a really strange sort of fixation in his mind. He became convinced that he was going to be buried alive. Now, this is absolutely true. You know, you always hear the stories. Poe wrote the story about it. Well, he was actually convinced that it could happen to him, and that he had the resources to make sure it didn't happen. He actually found, and this is true, he found an empty mausoleum in that he liked in a cemetery across town. He bought it and had it reassembled for himself and his wife in Highland Lawn Cemetery. Not only that, but when he died in 1931, he left a very peculiar will. And I can tell you guys, this part is absolutely true. In a 50-page will, he said that he was to be buried unembalmed, above ground. Next to his casket, there was to be a rocking chair, a table, a bottle of whiskey and a glass, and believe it or not, a live telephone line. And he left enough in an annuity to pay for this live telephone line. Absolutely true. Well, it was followed. His idea apparently was that if he woke up in his casket, I love this guy, he could claw his way out, sit down in the rocking chair, pour himself a slug of whiskey, call a taxi, and wait till it arrived. You gotta love pre-planning, don't you, you know? And actually, I have talked to a gentleman, I know a gentleman, who worked for the telephone company, and up until about 1987, his job, every month, he had keys to the crypt, and his job was he had to go in, unlock the crypt, walk in, make sure there wasn't a dial tone, and then set it down again. So this really did happen. 1987, the cemetery was redoing some land. They figured that if he hadn't gotten up by now, he probably wasn't going to, so they actually had to go to court and bust the will to tear down the telephone line. But where the legend begins, where the story begins, happens a lot earlier than that. Because you see, about 10 years after he died, his wife passed away. Well, it was perfectly natural causes. She had had a bad heart for a long time, and she had a heart attack. She was living by herself, and she was found dead in the kitchen clutching a telephone. The supposition being that she felt a heart attack coming on. She got to the phone to try to call a doctor, and the heart attack killed her before she could make the call. That was the easy supposition. Everybody believed it. They believed it during the funeral. They believed it when her body was taken to the Heil family mausoleum. But some began to wonder when they opened up that mausoleum, because the phone next to John Heil's casket was off its hook. And some believed that maybe that heart attack was hastened by a phone call she never thought she'd get.